Hello, and welcome back to the Becoming Ageless podcast, where we have conversations about whole health for naturally increasing health span and decreasing biological age. I'm your host, Robynn Fredericks, holistic health practitioner, and I believe in living agelessly. So, I have one of my fave researchers here with me today, and I can't wait to dig into our conversation. So, allow me to introduce you to Kiran Krishnan. He is a research microbiologist, and he's been involved in the dietary supplement and nutrition market for the past 18 years. He comes from a university research background, having spent several years with hands-on R&D in the fields of molecular medicine and microbiology at the University of Iowa, and Kiran has established a clinical research organization where he's designed and conducted dozens of human clinical trials in human nutrition. He's also the co founder and partner in New Science Trading, which is a nutritional technology development and research company. He's co founder and chief scientific officer at Microbiome Labs. He is a frequent lecturer at the Human Microbiome medical and nutrition conferences. He's the expert guest on national and satellite radio, has appeared in several international documentaries, and has been a guest speaker on several international health summits as a microbiome expert. He's currently involved in 16 novel human clinical trials on probiotics and on the human microbiome. He's also on the scientific advisory board for 7 other companies in the industry. And all I can say is, I don't know how you have time for all of this. So I've had the privilege of listening to Karen speak on numerous occasions, and I'm always completely blown away by the information. And trust me, you're going to want to get your pen and paper out for this one and get ready to take some serious notes. We have a lot to cover, and even more I would love to get into, but that would take hours and hours, and I'm not going to do that to him. But we can start with a bit of a grouping. We're going to be chatting about gut brain axis with respect to mood, stress, anxiety, brain aging. We're going to touch on mitochondrial health and aging. And if we have time, Karen, I would love to hear about some of the work that you're doing on skin health and aging or anything else that might come up. So, welcome to the show, Karen. Thank you so much for being on with us today.
Robin, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I know I've been since we got to meet in person, I think back in September of last year.
Yeah.
It was right. It was such a pleasure to meet you, and I was very excited to be on your program at some point. So
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, when you're listening, you guys, to Karen speak, he is such a wealth of knowledge that, you just kind of take in and you dissect it all. But there's only, bits and pieces that you actually bring home to people who don't really want to know the science. And Karen, that piece of information that I brought home that completely changed the way that I run my household is we now have a law. When you poop, the toilet seat goes down. When you flush,
smart. I like it. That's that.
I
I was just at a health conference this past weekend in Las Vegas, and that was so much of the take home from there as well. But it makes sense. It's practical. We can dig into why as well for your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. And yeah, my guests even know it. My husband's a little bit embarrassed, I think, when I tell my guests that they have to close the lid. But, we do what we have to do to protect ourselves. We are our priority. So
Exactly.
I have to start out by asking the same question I ask all of my guests. And that is, what are you doing on a personal basis to live agelessly and increasing your health span?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm an example of somebody that puts their body through a lot of stress, right? Physical, mental, all of that, because of the number of things that I do professionally. Just the hours of work and late nights and all of that stuff. I also travel a significant amount. So I travel somewhere around 60, 70% of the time. And I'm often at, 6, 7 different time zones in a couple of weeks, including European time zones, Asian time zones, and so on. So
My goodness.
I'm all over the place. I put my body through a lot of stress. And with all of that, then I become heavily focused on the aspects of my health that build resilience, right? So I'm very big on a goal of resiliency because the way I want to live is I don't want to be healthy if I only make perfect choices, right?
Right.
I want to be able to make good choices 80% of the time, but have that fun 20% of the time and still be fine, right? That's the resiliency component to it.
Right.
So I focus on a few things. For me, it's about fasting. Fasting gives me a lot of opportunity for metabolic control to improve my cellular conditioning, turnover of cells, cleaning up debris and all that you created from the travel and the stress and the eating poor food outside and all that, the lack of sleep and so on. So that's one of the things. Number two, I really focus on decompressing, right? So I'm really good at escaping into like a bad reality show or reading a book, or something like that that takes me out of my work mind, out of that beta wave, and puts me more into my kind of my uh, beta wave bands, where it's more kind of meditative and that kind of lost feeling where your mind is
Yeah.
allowed to go introspective and move around. I also pamper myself. I love massages. I do spas and massages and all that, which really helps. So then beyond those lifestyle things, I focus on my gut health because ultimately, if you have a strong gut, you've got a strong immune system, you've got great hormone balance, you've got a really good digestive tract that can handle big varieties in food and changes in what you, and then it impacts things like your skin, your muscle tone, your metabolic health, your energy, your sleep, and mood, which is a big part of it as well, right? Because as we go through stresses and all that. So I do some of those lifestyle things, and then I really focus in on gut health, which is again part of the existence of the company.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So when you do fasting, are you talking intermittent fasting or do you do water fasting or what do you do?
Yeah, I do intermittent fasting. For me, it's basically 6, 7 days a week where I try to incorporate somewhere around a 14 to 16 hour period where I'm not eating anything, and most of that is overnight, which is
Right.
easy. So it's somewhere between on average around 8 or 9 p.m. where you stop eating. And then your first meal the next day is somewhere around noon.
Right.
I do have a little bit of coffee from time to time in the morning, which is fine. And other than that, then I try to keep the fasting regimen. That to me has been, and that's something I started about 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Especially when the heavy travel started, because when I'm traveling that much, I can't rest as much as I need to. I can't work out or exercise anywhere as close as I need to. Right. And so you fall into this danger of metabolic dysfunction, right? And so the fasting has really kept that in check for me.
Nice. Nice. Fabulous. Well, we've got a lot to touch on and I'm just curious. There's so much research that's come out. I mean, I started getting involved in holistic nutrition, gosh, 2000, 2001. And, of course, we've all just repeated over and over and over again that, all disease begins in the guts, but we didn't really know what we were talking about back then, but somehow we just knew that was true. But today there is so much that we've learned. And it's like every time I open up the news, there's yet more research that's coming out about the microbiome. How much do you think we really know? I mean, do you think that we're still in the very early stages of all of this? Do you think that, oh, yeah, we've pretty much got it covered?
Yeah. That's a great question. So just to put in context for people, the amount of research going on in the last 5 years, there's been over 55,000 published studies on how the microbiome impacts human health, right? I mean, that's massive. We're
That's
talking
amazing.
over 10,000 published studies a year. That doesn't count all of the studies that got done that weren't published.
Yeah.
So I would estimate it's double the amount. So there may be around 100,000 studies completed in the last 5 years, which is just monumental when you think about it from a scientific perspective. We have published ourselves. Me and my scientific team, we've published, I think, 15 papers in the last 3 years or so. So we've done a lot of work ourselves.
Yeah.
But I do think we are still at the tip of the iceberg. And the reason I say that is because we now have a really clear understanding of how the microbiome or that the microbiome impacts our health, right? And we know how it impacts, and we know that it impacts many different conditions. What we still are unaware of is at the cellular level, how some of these things are done. And some of the biology involved in the microbiome is biology that we don't quite understand yet, meaning these are new biological processes that we're not familiar with. Right. And so it's really fascinating when we come to discover those. I think we'll start opening up a whole new layer of science that we really had no clue about earlier. It's kind of like what happened, and I don't know if there's any physics nerds on the listening to the program, but I'm a big physics nerd as well. It's kind of what happened when Einstein and those guys started talking about quantum mechanics, right? So we knew we had Newtonian physics, the movement of the big things. But then all of a sudden they start talking about this crazy stuff called quantum mechanics, like, subatomic particles that just blew your mind. That's where we are with the microbiome. We're going to like space age fantasy land with some of this stuff where you're like, how does this stuff work?
Yeah.
We know it works.
Yeah.
We're still trying to figure out how it works.
Yeah. It's exciting. It's exciting. And most of my listeners know that I have a very personal relationship with my microbiome. I talk to it daily, and I've named it Mikey because it's just a little bit more personal. And, I don't know where Mikey is exactly other than everywhere.
Sure.
So I just, hey, Mikey, what can I do for you today? Now I'm sure every single one of my listeners, you guys all know what microbiome is, but just in case we have a newbie on, can you give like a elevator pitch of what is a microbiome?
Yeah. So the word microbiome basically describes the totality of organisms that exist within the human host, right? And not only is it the organisms, but more importantly, their genetic elements. And this is a really important thing to press on. And I think your audience needs to understand the importance of the microbiome because without our microbiome, we would cease to exist.
Right.
Fact, it is not an exaggeration to say that our microbiome makes up 90% of who and what we are.
Yeah.
Right. What we've known as the human system, the stuff we can see, our own human cells, our organ systems and all that really conducts about 10% of the functions. Okay.
Right.
Right. The other 90% is really conducted by the microbiome. To give you an example of that is like, if you look at our genetics, we've known for a long time that our genes control lots of things, right? When you look at the human system, we have about 22,000 functional genes. And that sounds like a lot to people who are not familiar with genetics. But if you look at an earthworm that has 30,000 genes, an earthworm has more genes than a human does, right? And so then the big question was, how are we so sophisticated? How are we at the top of the food chain, top of the evolutionary ladder? And that's because we have over 2.5 million microbial genes in our system. So the microbes confer to us or transform us into metabolic creatures that can do things that we would not be able to do on our own, right? So basic daily functionality to be human, the vast majority of that comes from the microbes that live in and on us. And so if we don't have adequate amount of those microbes,
Hmm.
cease to be able to conduct certain functions. And we see that then in disease,
Right.
right? So it's an exciting time for sure, because so many of the chronic illnesses that we thought of being just bad luck, genetic issues, like scary ones like Alzheimer's and dementia and Parkinson's disease and, possibly ALS and obesity and diabetes and cancers. We thought of all of those as being like, oh, whoops, bad luck, you got cancer, bad luck, you got Alzheimer's, right? Or you have a genetic deficiency or something. Most of the chronic illnesses we deal with, autoimmune conditions and mental disorders, most of those are tracked back to some dysfunction in the microbiome,
Right.
which means that it's an ecological problem in the human system, right? There's an ecological imbalance within our microbiome, which means it's all correctable. So it's super exciting to know that some of these really scary diseases that we thought were incurable, um, in the next several years will be cured by a simple probiotic or prebiotic. And, it's such an exciting time to understand that. And it also tells us that we have a lot more control over our outcome than we previously thought, right? So everyone listening today should understand that they have a lot more power in deciding what their health outcomes are going to be, whether it's simple cosmetic stuff that you care about or it's really important longevity stuff that you care about. You have a lot more power within your own capabilities and choices to improve your outcomes than you previously thought. We used to lean a lot more on our doctors and all that for help, for guidance, but there's so many simple things we can do to help ensure better outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So in really simple terms, our microbiome, are they basically bugs, viruses, fungus?
Yep. A huge variety of bugs. This bacteria still predominate our microbiome, but we have viruses, we have fungi, we have protozoa, we have amoebas, we have all kinds of microorganisms all over our body. There's not a spot in your body that's really sterile. We used to think, for example, that urine is sterile. I always heard that when I was younger, right?
Yeah.
Urine is full of bacteria and viruses and all. We used to think our blood was sterile. Like if your doctor found bacteria in your blood, they would freak out that you're going into septicemia. But we know that for every milliliter of blood, we have over 5,000 bacteria cells, and we have somewhere around like 5,500 milliliters of blood in our system, right? So we have a lot of bacteria just floating around in our blood.
Yeah.
Our eyeballs are full of bacteria and viruses. Our cerebral spinal fluid, right, which is super important, connecting our central nervous system and in the brain, full of viruses and bacteria.
Yeah.
So everything is covered with microbes.
So we are essentially 90% bug and
Mhm.
10% human.
Yep. We are we are, there's a new term for a human. It's
Okay.
holobiont. A holobiont is a super organism. That's essentially what we are. We're a walking, talking rainforest. We are an ecosystem where every part of our body has a slightly different ecology. And ecology of that part dictates the function of that part, right? And all the parts have to talk together in order to work as a whole. So a holobiont is a super organism. We are a living organism made up of thousands of different organisms that have to work together to perpetuate the health of the whole.
Right. And that's a lot of the research that's been coming out over the past year or two is how our microbiome is talking to our brain and our lung, and our lungs are talking to the microbiome, and there's this cross communication going on. Can you touch on that a little bit? Explain what in the heck is going on?
Yeah. So it's super interesting because, when you hear about that, you hear it defined as like the gut brain axis, right? Or the gut skin axis or the gut lung axis. And the reason why in all of those axes, the gut is involved is because the gut houses the largest proportion of all of the microbes within your system, right? And the gut also houses the largest proportion of all the immune cells in your system. And so the gut becomes kind of the central command center for how a lot of the other organ systems behave, because a lot of the other organ systems are supposed to adapt to your environment, to your stressors, to the things that are happening to you as you move and you change your environment around you, your relationships around you, and so on. But all of those things all those changes are perceived by the gut first, right? And so, and it makes so much sense now when we think about, like, let's say you walk into a room and something doesn't sound right, right, or feel right.
Right.
We always said, "Oh, I had a gut feeling that something was off," right? There's a reason for that. Or with people you engage with, "Oh, I have a gut feeling that I'm going to like them." There's something.
They're butterflies.
Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Those butterflies, there's real biology to that, where there's a reason why we used to say that. We didn't understand the biology then, but now we're starting to see that it's the gut that's doing the largest portion of perceiving, measuring, testing the outside world so that the rest of your body can adapt to your environment. And most of those messages are being translated to the gut. Also, of course, if the immune system is largely predominant in your gut, then how the immune system functions throughout the rest of your body is dictated by what's going on in the gut as well, right? And not to mention, most of the nutrients you get in your world, in your life, come through the gut. So every organ system you have in your body is nutrients, right? Micronutrients, macronutrients, and so on. All of those come through the gut. And so the gut becomes this really, really important place, central command center that dictates the functionality of most other parts of the body.
That is really so fascinating to me. Um, I don't even know where to start with this. Let's go top down.
Yeah. I
So looking at the brain, we're finding that, and as you mentioned earlier, the microbiome has a part to do with whether or not we get Alzheimer's or the brain health and brain aging.
Yep.
How does that happen?
Yeah. So here's a really interesting thing, right? I just did a lecture on this yesterday to health professionals. And one of my first statements was, if you think about anxiety we're facing, right? Most people are facing huge portion of the population deals with some level of anxiety every day, or the depression that people face, or the mood disorders that people face, right? All of those things are pre-Alzheimer's or pre-dementia symptomologies, right? And the reason for that is because the pathology of dysfunction that leads to sleeplessness, leads to anxiety, leads to mood disorders, leads to depression, is the same exact pathology that'll eventually lead to neurodegeneration that becomes Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or dementia, right? It's all the same exact pathology. And so we are experiencing it now as anxiety, as sleep disorders, and so on. But as those go on, it's eating away literally at your brain.
Mm.
Right? So you're losing neurological tissue. So let me explain what that means. Because I'm sure people are like, what the hell is he talking about? Okay. So, current day neurological dysfunction leads to neurological degeneration over time, right?
Yes.
And the reason for that is because the gut plays a central role in controlling inflammatory responses that affect the brain, right? I'll give you two big examples of that, two big pathologies that we have to pay attention to. And when we think about the gut and the brain axis, one really important thing for people to understand is we often talk about how the gut supports the brain and the brain impacts the gut and so on. We talk about the relationship there. But one thing that's not highlighted as enough is that if you have an unhealthy gut, not only is it not supporting the brain, it actually becomes one of the most toxigenic things to your brain,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
We know all these behaviors we can do that are toxigenic to the brain, right? Like being in certain environments where we breathe in fumes and the things we drink and eat and all that.
Right.
But ultimately, the most toxigenic thing to the brain is a dysfunctional gut. Because not only is it not supporting the brain, it's actually harming the brain on a daily basis. And we feel that harm as sleeplessness. We feel that harm as anxiety. We feel that harm as poor stress management. But that same harm is happening every single day that's going to lead to enough damage to the brain so you end up with Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and so on, right?
Right.
So let me just talk about those two big pathologies that are really
Okay.
important. The first one is leaky gut, right? I'm sure everyone's heard of leaky gut. One of the big outcomes of leaky gut is the translocation or leaking in of an endotoxin called LPS, lipopolysaccharide, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's called an endotoxin because it's made in the system. It's not an exotoxin that comes in from the outside. So it's not something you can get away from, right? An exotoxin is like mold toxin in your house.
Right.
You can get your home remediated or you can move and leave the environment. Endotoxin is one that's constantly made in your system, so you can't get away from it. This endotoxin, LPS, is probably one of the most egregious endotoxins we get exposed to. It's made by gram-negative bacteria in your gut. What does gram-negative mean? It doesn't matter. Just know that gram-negative bacteria make up about 50% of all the microbes that live in your gut. right? Or in your body in general, especially in your mouth. So between your mouth and your gut, you house a lot of gram-negative bacteria. They all make this little compound called LPS, which is stuck in the cell membrane of the bacteria. When it's stuck in the cell membrane of the bacteria, it's not really a problem, right? It doesn't offer any toxic effect to us. However, when bacteria die, they basically break up and they lyse open, right? Then that LPS gets released from their membrane. Now it's floating around and it's now a very toxigenic compound. Normally, in the digestive tract, if you have a healthy digestive tract, that LPS gets stuck in the mucosal layer, right? And then it's taken out through defecation. So you poop out all that LPS and it doesn't really bother you, right?
Right.
But if your gut is unhealthy and it's leaky, that LPS is allowed to leak through the gut lining and end up in your circulation. Once it's in your circulation, it can make its way through many parts of the body, right? Virtually everywhere. LPS is the number one driver of the onset of Alzheimer's disease.
Mm.
In 2017, so let's talk about Alzheimer's for a second, right? So
Okay.
for 2 decades now, they've known that Alzheimer's is obviously a neurodegenerative condition. About 15, 16 years ago, they figured out that, there's something called beta plaquing that occurs in the Alzheimer's brain, right? When you look at the brain, when you look at images, you see these plaques that are forming all over the brain. Those plaques indicate some sort of damage to the neurological tissue that then plaques over like a scab, if you will, if you cut your skin. Then they figured out that there is an inflammatory condition going on in the brain that leads to the neurodegeneration, that leads to the damage to the brain tissue. That's where the plaque forms, right? But the big mystery was what is driving the inflammatory condition in these people's brains,
Right.
right? In 2017, in September, a pretty landmark study showed that the cause of the inflammatory damage in the brain tissue was gut-derived LPS, endotoxin, right? The same LPS I just talked about. When you have leaky gut and it leaks through the lining of the gut, ends up in circulation, that little LPS molecule can move through your circulation into your brain, lodge itself into the brain tissue, and it triggers a massive inflammatory response in the brain, thereby your immune system attacking and destroying your own brain tissue. As that happens over time, the brain tissue doesn't regenerate as fast, right?
Right.
So when you're younger and that's happening, your brain tissue can kind of start repairing itself every night, hopefully if you're getting enough rest. But as you get older and cellular repair slows down, then you end up with the net damage and not able to repair it enough. So then you start seeing these beta plaques where the brain was not able to regenerate itself.
Right. But now can you repair it though once, we make a decision today? Is it possible to repair it?
So the interesting thing is we don't have research yet to see if we can reverse that. But what seems to be clear, and this is just based on the pure scientific rationale of how it happens, what seems to be clear is that we should definitely be able to slow it down.
Okay.
Stop it from progressing, right? Because it's the LPS that's driving this. So if the LPS isn't leaking into your system and ending up in the brain, there's no need for the inflammatory response to occur, right?
Yes.
So then the focus should be how do we stop LPS? Now, what's interesting about LPS is it's also the same thing that drives anxiety and depression, right? There's a number of studies that have shown that serum LPS levels was the biggest predictor and the biggest risk factor for developing anxiety and major depressive disorders.
Mm.
Not only does it drive the development of anxiety and major depressive disorders, you can also predict the severity of the anxiety and major depressive disorders based on the level of LPS in the system, right? And they've done, like the Netherlands did a big 9-year-long study on this to look at the predictability of long-term anxiety and depression. And if LPS was just there, maybe just in the beginning, or was it there through a 9-year follow-up? And they found, sure enough, after 9 years of following up, that was still the case. The people that had the highest levels of LPS had the most severe anxiety and depression. People with medium levels had medium level anxiety and depression. And then the people that they identified in that beginning of the 9-year study that had no LPS leaking in, after 9 years, they still had no LPS leaking in and they had no anxiety and depression. Right?
Goodness.
So they've done this through a number of different iterations. They've also gone as far as doing studies showing which kind of inflammatory cytokines are triggered by the presence of LPS in the system, and how those inflammatory cytokines then can predict the severity of anxiety and depression, right? So it's absolutely clear that if LPS is leaking through because you have leaky gut, then entering into your system as you're younger, when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, it's going to be causing issues like anxiety, depression, sleep disorders and cognitive slowing down and so on, right? We know that LPS can get into parts of the brain where it can slow down memory recall. That's part of the reason why our brain starts slowing down as we get older, right? More of that inflammatory damage that occurs. And as we age and as it becomes harder and harder for the brain to repair itself from the LPS damage, then we start moving to the neurodegenerative spectrum, where now our anxiety, depression, sleep disorder expressions are now becoming long-term neurodegenerative expressions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. Right. So it's so important for people to understand that and think about that because, when you're in your 40s and 50s, we're not only concerned about how we function now, we're getting to the point where we really have to be concerned about how we're going to function in our 60s, 70s, and beyond, right?
Absolutely.
We don't want, many of us may have had parents that have gone through dementia and Alzheimer's, or we are actively taking care of parents that are going through that.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely scary, right? To me, it's one of the scariest conditions you can deal with because forget who you are. You forget who your loved ones are. I can't even wrap my head around what that experience feels like.
Yeah.
But the things you're dealing with now, the fact that you couldn't fall asleep last night, right? The fact that you woke up this morning stressed and anxious, those are all precursors to having that problem 10 years, 12 years, 15 years from now, right? So
can anxiety and stress itself, aside from a bad diet, can those things contribute to a leaky gut?
yes. So that's part of the problem is that it's a feedback loop, right? So let's say your gut gets damaged because of poor choices over a period of time or, multiple courses of antibiotics, whatever led to the damage in the gut that caused it to become leaky. That leakiness drives anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, and so on. And then the anxiety, depression, sleep disorders actually make your gut more leaky and make it worse, right? And here's one of the reasons why. So your gut becomes leaky. You start getting lots of LPS flooding in. That LPS starts setting up anxiousness, starts setting up sleep disorders, and so on. And because you're anxious, because you have sleep disorders, you have high stress hormone levels, there are lots of opportunistic organisms that live in your system that have evolved to read those stress signals as their reason to start proliferating their virulence factors, right? So because you're stressed, because you're not sleeping well, now more opportunistic pathogens are actually taking over in your system, and they will drive more anxiety and depression because for them, that's a good scenario, right? You want the host to be in that inflamed fight or fight response all the time because that's the scenario in which they do the best. So as they start taking hold and getting a hold of the group of the ecosystem, they will perpetuate your feeling of anxiousness and all that. In fact, some of the microbes and all that can actually produce neurotransmitters that make you feel panicked and give you panic disorders, right? And so it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, and it has to be arrested at some point. The best way to start that is by starting to fix the original problem, which is the leakiness in the gut.
Right.
So that's one of the main two pathophysiologies. I talked about earlier how there's two big things to keep in mind, right?
Right.
First one is leaky gut, LPS coming in. LPS is causing inflammation and degeneration of neurological tissue, driving anxiety, depression, and so on. And then the anxiety, depression, and all that drives more leaky gut, and it keeps cycling, right? The second one is stress-induced inflammation. right? So one of the things that occurs, or the main thing that occurs when you experience stress, external stressors, and I'm talking about simple things like somebody cuts you off on your way to work, or a bigger problem with the loved one, or with a significant other.
Mhm.
Um, those external stressors, the first part of your body that they triggered is your hypothalamus, right? So your
Right.
hypothalamus is designed to perceive stress that's coming in and then start kicking on the flight or fight response. Because remember, through the course of human evolution, the major amounts of the vast majority of human evolution, stress was a survival mechanism, right?
Right.
We were attuned to understand potential stressors in our environment that could kill us, right? We don't have that as much anymore. So, but little things stress us out now, right? Like
Yeah.
email not loading fast enough, right? Like just the silliest things.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right? Bad hair day can stress the entire day.
My Google keyboard that constantly changes the words on me. Like,
Oh, yeah. Autocorrect. Think about how many stress bubbles people have created from the autocorrect,
oh,
right? So there's just so many things that drive us crazy these days, but none of it is life or death, right?
got it.
However, your body responds to it as if it's life or death, right? Because we still have that same exact flight or fight response that has kept the human species alive for, millions of years, have avoided us from getting eaten by predators and killed by, other rivaling tribes and whatever else is out there that was killing us as early humans. That same response is there if somebody cuts us off in traffic, right? So let's talk about what happens there. For example,
Yeah.
um, let's say you wake up in the morning, you experience an external stressor. It could be any small thing. Your hypothalamus gets triggered. Your hypothalamus releases a hormone that then stimulates your pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases another hormone that then stimulates your adrenal gland, right? So that is what most people have heard of as the HPA axis,
Right.
hypothalamus adrenal pituitary axis, right? Or the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So then eventually what happens from that axis being activated is the adrenals releases cortisol. Cortisol, most people know, is your stress hormone.
Mm.
So as you're experiencing the stressor, cortisol levels steadily increase in your circulation, right? So then what happens is cortisol dumps into the gut. And there's a couple of reasons why cortisol makes its way into the gut, right? Actually, probably a half a dozen reasons, but we'll talk about a couple of important ones.
Okay.
One reason is because there are microbes in the gut that'll actually metabolize cortisol and send the byproducts of that metabolizing of cortisol to the liver, to the kidneys. That will stimulate the release of sodium and potassium ions into the bloodstream. And that increases our blood pressure, because what we need in the flight or fight response is increased blood pressure, right? Because we're trying
Right.
to perfuse critical parts of the body. Now, at the same time, cortisol also acts as its own negative feedback, right? As cortisol levels increase high enough in the gut and other parts of the body, it starts binding these things called glucocorticoid receptors. As it binds more and more receptors, the receptors start sending a negative feedback signal to bring down the system from the fight or flight response, right? And then at the same time, as all this is happening, as the HPA axis gets triggered and causes the release of cortisol, the HPA axis also triggers the sympathetic nervous system, right? If you look at your nervous system, you basically have two tones to it. One is called the parasympathetic, which is known as the rest and digest part of your tone, right? That's what happens when you're resting and repairing and digesting and all that. And then you have the sympathetic, which is the flight or fight response, right?
Right.
When the sympathetic nervous system is triggered, basically its job is to increase your heart rate, increase your respiration, focus blood into your brain, your heart, and your muscles, and away from other parts of the body, because now it's preparing you to fight or flee from whatever danger is there, right? Now, the sympathetic nervous system, the way it increases blood perfusion into places like your heart or your brain is by increasing inflammation, right? Inflammation is blood flow. Inflammation is perfusion. Remember, on the other end, cortisol is increasing blood pressure, so that now your heart is able to pump more blood because of the increased blood pressure. And then the sympathetic nervous system is turning on inflammation in areas where it wants the blood to go, right? Inflammation directs blood into the right location.
Right.
The way the sympathetic nervous system turns on the inflammatory process is by activating macrophages and other immune cells that then release all these massive inflammatory signals or cytokines in the brain, in the heart, and other parts of the muscles. So it's trying to draw blood into that area, right? So now you've experienced a stressor. This is what your body looks like, right? Your body is under tension right now. Your blood pressures increase, your respiratory rates increase, you're inflamed in your brain, in your heart, and other critical parts of the body. You're fully inflamed, cannot rest or digest or repair because you're not working on the parasympathetic. You're working in the sympathetic. You're ready to fight or flee, right? Now, what's supposed to happen is you go through that cycle. The moment you get away from the danger, then everything comes back down. The inflammation comes back down. You go away from the sympathetic back to the parasympathetic so you can now rest and relax and repair any damage that occurred through that inflammatory cascading and explosion and all that.
Right.
And then hopefully at night, you can sleep and repair all the damage that occurred, right? But what tends to happen in the modern day that did not probably happen so much throughout the course of human evolution is that when we experience a stressor, we cannot come down from it effectively, right? That's the big difference, right? Like our ancestors will walk through the grasslands, see something that looks really scary, get this flight or fight response, be able to run away from the danger, climb a tree or something, hide. And then when the danger is gone, they would come down from the stressor, go back to the normal basal state of functioning, right? In modern day, you wake up in the morning, somebody cuts you off on the way to work, inflamed because of the stressor, and you don't actually come down from it.
Oh, yeah. We feed on it.
You feed on it. And there's a reason why, right? And we think of it like mentally. We think about like, oh, my mind keeps racing and I can't stop the thoughts, right?
Right.
And then like smaller and smaller other things compound on that stress. And before you know it, you're having what we call a bad day because there's all of these things that compound together to amplify your stress level, right? But it's not cognitive as it is biological, right? There's a reason why we cannot stop those thoughts. There's a reason why we can't rationalize the little different things that are adding on to it and go, okay, I can deal with that. That's done. I can deal with that. That's done. Instead, all of it compounds together and we're like, holy cow, we're overwhelmed and I can't take it. And now you're thinking about it all day. Your gut feels weird when you eat lunch. You don't digest food properly, right? It's bloated and maybe you have to run to the bathroom. And then you finally get home and you want to have a glass of wine to try to relax, and you might relax for a minute or two, but then you try to sleep and you can't sleep.
Yeah.
Because all the thoughts from the day are still running through your head and all that, right?
Yeah.
We think of all of those predominantly as behavioral things, but they're not, because I can explain to you biologically what's happening, why you can't come down from each of those stressors and why they all compound together. Okay. So this is the second big physiological thing, right? So remember LPS, let's not forget.
LPS. Uh-huh.
Right? Leaky gut, LPS, driving all kinds of bad stuff. This is the second piece of it. What's supposed to happen in a healthy gut when cortisol dumps into the gut? As I mentioned, part of it gets metabolized to increase blood pressure. The other part is supposed to bind up glucocorticoid receptors and start bringing the system back down from that stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in an unhealthy gut, what tends to happen when cortisol dumps in is cortisol makes the gut more leaky. So it actually drives this temporary leaky gut. It's a pretty profound amount of leaky gut. And then what happens because the gut is leaky, that inflammation goes up. And there's one particular inflammatory molecule that's a big problem in this whole process. And that's a molecule called interleukin 6 or IL-6, right? When IL-6 increases, what it does is it goes back and re-triggers the hypothalamus and causing the HPA axis to activate again, releasing even more cortisol, right? And so now a single stressor that released one batch of cortisol will continuously release cortisol throughout the day because your cortisol is dumping into your gut, making your gut leaky, increasing inflammation in IL-6. IL-6 is re-triggering your HPA axis. Other egregious thing that IL-6 does which is a double whammy on the system, is it reduces the expression of those glucocorticoid receptors. Remember, those are those receptors that cortisol is supposed to bind to provide negative feedback to bring the whole system down, right? And that brings down the sympathetic nervous system as well.
Right.
So IL-6 is not only triggering the HPA axis, but it's preventing cortisol from acting as its own negative feedback. So it becomes so hard to actually come down from that, right? So one stressor puts us at this level of stress, right? An elevated level of stress. Now our tolerance level is low. So then other smaller stressors simply compound on that over and over again. And we are continuously biologically in a flight or fight response.
Yeah.
When you're in a flight or fight response, there's a part of your brain called the coping centers that aren't activated. Coping centers of the brain aren't functioning. The coping center of the brain is very important to rationalize the stressor, right? To think about it in a rational way and go, I know what to do with this. You solve a problem and then you're done with it. And the coping center also negates the negative emotions that are associated with the stress. It allows you to look at the stressor from a more practical standpoint, deal with that stressor, and then move on from it, right? It negates that emotional spiraling.
Right.
Coping centers of the brain cannot turn on when your gut is leaky and when HPA axis keeps being activated. And that's because your gut is dysfunctional, right? So there's a component in the gut, in a healthy gut, that stops all of this process. And that is some bacteria make a byproduct called peptidoglycans. Peptidoglycans are these unique things that bacteria make. And these peptidoglycans are the key things to stopping that inflammatory recycling in the gut when cortisol dumps in. It prevents cortisol from making the gut leak. It prevents that expression of IL-6, which will go and re-trigger the HPA axis. And it can also bind to neurotransmitter signaling in the gut to actually change your brain waves in response to stress, where your coping centers of the brain activate so that you can deal with the stress in a logical way and move on from it.
Gotcha. So how do we increase that?
Yeah, that's the magic question.
Yeah, it's a magic pill. What is that?
I would not have gone through this painstaking explanation for you and your audience if there wasn't a solution.
Thank God.
Think about the amount of stress I would have caused, like every day, if I explained them how messed up the system is, and now you can't do anything about it. No. So the great thing about it is, we did a whole series of studies over some more years, almost 7, 8 years, looking at individuals that really dealt well with stress and slept well, compare them to age-matched individuals and health-matched individuals that really did not deal well with stress and did not sleep well, right? We were looking at the microbiomes to see what is the fundamental difference between the microbiomes.
Mhm.
As it turns out, the people that really managed stress well and sleep well tended to have higher levels of a microbe called bifidolongum. And bifidolongum, in particular, a version of it that produces something called exopolysaccharide, right? And the exopolysaccharide is made up of peptidoglycans. So we found over and over again that, hey, these individuals with high levels of this bacteria that produces this thing seems to have really good stress management, sleeps well, has high activation of the coping centers of the brain, and high theta function, so they can be meditative, they can be relaxed. They had all of this functionality in them. And the fundamental difference between their microbiome and the people that really dealt with stress poorly and all that was the presence of this organism, right? So we isolated the organism and we started studying it. We started with animal model studies, looking at stress-induced inflammation and HPA activation and all that. And we saw in those animal studies that, yes, all of that inflammatory pathology came down when you brought in this organism. So then we started doing human studies where we would dose a treatment group versus a placebo group over a 30-day period with this probiotic bacteria, the single bacteria. And then we would induce a stress in them in the end of the 30-day period and then measure how the two groups responded to the stress, right? We looked at things like cortisol levels, inflammation, perception of the stress, how long the stress perception existed, all of that stuff. What we started to find is that when you take this particular bacteria with the peptidoglycan and the exopolysaccharide, that it dramatically reduced cortisol response to the stress. It dramatically reduced the perception of the stress, and it activated the centers of the brain, the coping centers of the brain that helped you deal with the stress in a rational way, right? Then we put people through social stress scenarios, and then we did a number of sleep studies, and we found the same thing over and over again, that we could activate theta wave bands in the brain so that people are more rational and meditative about things, more relaxed about things. We can activate coping centers of the brain. We can reduce cortisol, reduce all the inflammatory responses, and reduce the HPA reactivation that occurs from a single bout of stress. So this to us became kind of a central theme of, wait a minute, so we can really modulate how the brain responds to stress by having just this one microbe in the gut, right? And think about how powerful this microbe is, because the peptidoglycan that it produces, not only is it important for us as adults to deal with stress in a healthy way, to induce sleep in a healthy way, and I'll talk about the sleep in a little bit, and also to activate different coping centers and cognitive centers of the brain. But it's also the same compound that when you were in utero, in your mom's womb, was a critical compound to induce brain development in the child, right? So mom's gut bacteria, if she has adequate amounts of peptidoglycan, that peptidoglycan will actually be transported to the baby's placenta and then eventually to the baby's brain to induce and stimulate brain development in the baby. Right? So it was important when you were developing as a human. It's equally important now when you are a full-grown human to start reducing all of that inflammatory damage that stress and all that causes, right? And then here's another beautiful aspect of it. When you are undergoing that continuous HPA activation, right? When cortisol is making your gut leaky, IL-6 is going up, causing all that reactivation of your HPA axis, another critical compound becomes downregulated. And that compound is called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, right? One of the most important roles of BDNF is to repair the brain from that day's stressors and that day's inflammatory damages, right? So that every day you can reset with the new healthy part of the brain, right? And if BDNF is not being expressed adequately, not only are you damaging your brain each day, you're also not repairing it very well. And so if you can bring down all of that inflammation, all of that HPA activation, then BDNF expression will go up so that you can deal with stresses much easily throughout the day. And then at night, you will repair any of the damage that did happen.
Right.
So that becomes the long-term component to the brain health piece, right? You're dealing with the stressors and all of today much better, but you're also protecting the brain over time in the long run, which is, of course, extremely important once you get into your 40s, 50s, and so on, right? So
Absolutely. Wow.
that makes sense. I know that was a ton of information, right? But there's really two themes here, right? There's this leaky gut. We have to
Right.
stop gut. We have to stop LPS from migrating through. And then the second part of it is the stress-induced reactivation of the HPA axis. And the key thing that stops that is this 1714 strain that makes this peptidoglycan, right? So if you can solve those two problems, then you're really supporting the brain in general.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that because I mean, so many people, we see some people who have that coping mechanism and the other people who don't. The people who have the coping mechanism are like, oh, all you need to do is just relax. And that just, I think, causes even more stress
Yeah,
because you just want to take, a snowball and throw it at them and say, hey,
exactly.
come
So
on.
people with the coping center, it will tell you things like, oh, just forget about it.
Yeah.
Oh, as if it's easy for you to do it because for them it's automatic, right? And I would put myself a little bit more into that annoying category of the oh, forget about it, because stress doesn't impact me as much, right?
Yeah.
I'm good at taking on what the stressor is, analyzing what I need to do with it. If it's something within my control, I'll do it. If it's something outside of my control, I go, it's outside of my control, move
Right.
on to something else. And that becomes very annoying for people like my wife, who's much more stressed and worked out, or, other people in the family. And I'm like, I think about the thing that's bothering them and I give them a solution that I think may work. And then they're like, yeah, but what about this? What about this? And I'm like, well, don't worry about that. It's out of your control. Like, how can I not worry about that? And I'm like, just don't worry about that, And to me, it always didn't make sense, like why they couldn't just stop worrying about it.
Right.
Now, when you understand the biology, you go, that part of their brain is not on.
Right.
The part of their brain that tells them not to worry about it and to rationalize it and go, okay, we'll put it aside. It's not on. The part of the brain that's going, holy crap, you're going to die from this. That's the part that's on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's just two completely different biological functions. And as it turns out, the good thing is it uses bacteria to turn on the right side of the brain.
That is very good news. I like that. We have resources, y'all. Okay, so you touched on sleep a little bit, and I would love to hear more about that. I've had sleep issues in the past, and they lasted me like 10 years. And thank God I've moved past that. I've got clients. I had one person reach out to me today, and she's going through some serious stress, and she was like, I can't shut cortisol off. It just won't shut off. We always hear make sure you have the right sleep environment. Is there more to all of this?
Yeah. I mean, so it's a lot of what we just talked about, right?
Right.
So remember, you sleep in the parasympathetic state. And the sympathetic state is when you're active and stressed and moving around. So if you think about how a single stressor in the morning, if your gut is unhealthy, right? If you don't have enough of this peptidoglycan and so on,
And that could just be an alarm clock going off and
or yes,
yeah,
or like a worry of being late to something, right?
yeah.
In the morning, or like like in our case, our kids, I can't get them to go and move, right?
Uh-huh.
They're like, put on your shoes. Like, put on your shoes. Put on get them to say that 17 times, right? That's enough of a stressor where that alone will keep you from sleeping at night. Because remember, we have that continuous HPA reactivation from a single stressor. Right? And as the HPA axis keeps reactivating, you stay in the sympathetic state. So as you're trying to go to bed at night, you're physically tired, right? Because your body is telling you, I'm done. I'm done making energy. You need to shut down so I can prepare myself and reset. But your brain is still in the sympathetic state. And as you lay down, the big kicker to this is as you lay down, you cannot fall asleep because you're in the sympathetic state. And guess what? You get stressed because you're not sleeping.
Right.
You get worried about not sleeping, right? You lay down and then before you know it, you're like, you're tapping around, you're trying to think about things, you're getting frustrated, you're rolling around. And then you might look at the clock and go, holy cow, I've been laying here for 40 minutes and I'm still not asleep. I'm wide awake. That is enough to trigger next wave of HPA activation, right?
Yeah.
It becomes so hard to actually sleep. What you is a parasympathetic activation in order to get yourself to sleep. And the parasympathetic can't turn on if the sympathetic is always on. And remember that check is in the gut as well. So that's why it was no surprise to us when we hypothesized that this 1714 strain that brings down cortisol, brings down the HPA activation, likely helps with sleep as well. So we took individuals that had some minor sleep issues, and what we did is supplemented with them. And what we saw was it dramatically reduced the time to sleep. So how long it took them to fall asleep. And then throughout the night, dramatically increased the efficiency of sleep, meaning they're sleeping through REM cycles better, they're deeper sleep and all that. So the sleep is more productive at
Right.
the end of it all, right?
Right.
It's really about just being able to move into that parasympathetic state.
Yeah.
Now, there's things we can do to try to help us induce that too, right? Like that's why some people say do some meditation before sleep, right? Because what does meditation do? It turns on the theta wave in your brain that brings back the parasympathetic state. People will say gargle with warm water, take a warm bath. All of those things are supposed to increase your what we call the sympathovagal tone, which is turning on the parasympathetic system. But of course, if you have the biological mechanism, the cellular mechanism that's preventing that from happening, it becomes really hard.
Yeah.
So if you do something like utilize a strain like this, which is called a psychobiotic strain, and then you add on those other behaviors like shutting off your screen so you don't get blue light for a couple hours before bed, doing a warm bath, gargling, trying to be meditative to a certain degree, kind of just relaxing overall, then you can really start inducing some good efficient sleep. But
Yeah.
that cellular biological component too, because if you're in that sympathetic state, it's impossible to sleep no matter what you do.
Yeah. Is there, I know that, we have probiotic strains that we can take to get this. Can you get it from food, from your diet?
Um, we are not aware of any foods that contain these types of.
Okay.
These are strains that are typically gut commensal organisms, right? So they're predominantly found in nature in our guts. So they're not necessarily strains that are used for fermentation and things like that. There are, of course, fermented foods that may help you sleep to a certain degree because they might have higher levels of things like L-theanine. You know, saffron can help with calming down and sleep. We know that, certain herbs like holy basil, ashwagandha that are adaptogens can help bring down the
Right.
stress response and maybe help with the parasympathetic. So those things can all be bolt-on additions, but ultimately it's the gut that dictates whether or not you're going to be sleeping that night.
Right.
So you need
Yeah.
to address the problem through the gut as well.
Yeah. So I like that. We've got to look at the biological as well as the psychological and really kind of address everything all at once. And I think that's really a take home key, y'all. I don't want to keep you too long, Kieran, but can you touch on a little bit of the skin research that you've been doing?
Yeah, yeah,
That could be a concern to us over 40s,
yeah.
over 50, let's be honest.
Somewhere over 37 and a half.
Exactly.
So that's a super interesting area. This became kind of a passion goal of mine when I realized that, um, you know, it's really crazy that we are first line of treatment for acne is 90 days of antibiotics, right? It blows my mind that that's where the technology is and that it's better than that, right? So you're taking younger people or people in their 20s and 30s who are still struggling with acne and just putting them on probiotics because because we now know about the microbiome that has long-term negative impacts, right? And so we started looking at the gut skin axis with a big focus around acne. And so we started seeing that you can stop leaky gut, right? And again, we work with the spore-based probiotics. That's our primary thing. The research spore-based strains, which is important to distinguish. What we found is that if you have the right spore-based probiotics in the right combination, then you can stop leaky gut. You can change what type of short chain fatty acids are being produced in the gut. Those short chain fatty acids and the combination of stopping leaky gut has a huge impact on the sebaceous glands and other aspects of the skin. So we did our first pilot study about 4 years ago, and we saw that we can reduce by taking just a probiotic, we can reduce inflammation on the skin. We can reduce the appearance and the formation of lesions, acne lesions, and that can also improve some of the hydration qualities of the skin. And we did some really, really high density camera work, which dermatologists use all the time to measure wrinkles and all that. And we saw some improvements in fine lines and wrinkles as well, right? All of which are based on health of the skin. And people should remember that health of the skin comes from underneath, right? The skin grows from the bottom out.
Right.
And so we put a lot of focus on things that are topical, and hopefully some of those things absorb down into other layers. But there's a lot of components of skin health that come in from the bottom out, right?
Right.
So from within aspect of it. So that's been our big focus is how do we reduce inflammation and the damage that inflammation causes to skin? Now, why does inflammation cause damage to the skin on the outside appearance? Well, a couple of reasons. We have inflammation on the bottom layers of the skin, right? The subdermal layers of the skin. What tends to happen is the proteins like collagen and elastin that keep the skin taut and tight, that prevents the wrinkles from forming, right? Where you can frown and then you have wrinkles or you're frowning and you stop frowning and the wrinkles go away, right? That's elastin and all that bouncing the skin back and making it taut. And so those fibers and those proteins get damaged over time from inflammation, right? And as they get damaged, they no longer can bounce the skin back. They're no longer as effective rubber bands as they used to be when you were younger. And so we tend to find that if you can reduce inflammation over time underneath the skin, you can improve the appearance of the skin or slow down the aging type of appearance of the skin. Right. So the gut is the key way of reducing that long-term inflammation that occurs in the skin. Again, gut plays a huge role in that inflammatory response as well. The other part of it is the nutrient availability, right? The skin requires lots of nutrients, antioxidants, micronutrients, minerals, all of that stuff. Most of that is absorbed through the gut and transported to the skin. And what we see in studies is that if you have damage to the gut, if your gut is inflamed, if your gut is leaking, you're not assimilating those nutrients well, and the skin's not getting what it needs. And one more layer to that is carotenoids. Carotenoids are these polyphenol compounds, typically comes from colored fruits and vegetables. They are some of the most biologically powerful antioxidants. High levels of carotenoids in the skin protect the skin from all kinds of damage, right? Damage. And then the most egregious damage nowadays that we're starting to talk about that's really not mainstream yet is the blue light damage to the skin. Right? This
Blue light damages the skin.
Yes, there's something called blue light irradiation of the skin. So exactly right. So we have to do that for the eyes, right? So that's why 90% of the day I'm wearing these when I'm in front of my computer, because we know that blue light damages the eyes and ages the eyes faster. So these kind of blue light glasses block the blue light from the screens that damage the eyes. But the same thing happens with the skin. Blue light can the skin. So think about how much time we're spending in front of our phones, in front of our computers and TVs and so on. That blue light irradiation is a big problem over time, right?
Yeah.
Then, people that used to commute to work, right? Your one hand or your two hands are exposed to sun more than the rest of your body. Your hands wrinkle up and get older faster, right?
Right.
And that used to be a thing people used to wear driving gloves or lotions or whatever to help with the hand. Same thing with blue light irradiation. It's just a different form of radiation, but it does damage the skin. So we're doing studies right now on one of our probiotic strains, which produces very high levels of carotenoids in the gut so that those carotenoids are very bioavailable. So we're looking at increasing the carotenoid levels in the skin so that the skin can fight against the damage that comes from irradiation, whether it's blue light, whether it's irradiation, right? So we've got two studies on that right now, and I think it's looking quite promising. So, we know we can reduce inflammation in the skin. We know we can make some improvements on fine lines and wrinkles and hydration. We know if you have acne and acne-like lesions, we can bring that down through the gut using the spore probiotics, and then using this one special spore probiotic we believe will show that we can also dramatically reduce blue light and other irradiation damage to the skin as well, increasing carotenoids. In the meantime, taking it, it's going to help your gut and it's going to probably help your skin as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. So to kind of wrap everything up, are there any tips that you can leave people with today that they can get started today doing something to make their gut less leaky, healthier, more diverse?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of things you can do, right? So
Mhm.
we'll talk about the easier, simple things that don't cost anything.
Okay.
First thing is intermittent fasting. Like I mentioned, that's one of the key things I do. So
Mhm.
if you show that intermittent fasting does increase the diversity in your microbiome, and the more diversity you have, not only will you have less likelihood of having leakiness in the gut, but you'll actually live longer as well. There's lots of longevity studies showing high diversity allows you to live longer. So
Yeah.
intermittent fasting is a big important part of it. You do it. You don't have to jump into a 16-hour fast every day. You could start with 12 hours, right? Go from 8 a.m. or some time frame like that. And then each week you can push it out a little bit longer. Then go 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., 8 p.m. to 10 a.m., just try it. Every little bit will help. So that's one thing. Number two is trying to increase the diversity in your diet. Right? The more diversity of foods, that more diverse your microbiome is going to be. especially when we look at things like roots and tubers and resistant starches and high fiber foods. Those things feed a lot of these critical bacteria within your system. Number three, which is actually really critically important, is you don't need to sterilize most of your home, right? We all tend to live in an over sterilized environment. And studies are pretty clear that there's a huge impact to your microbiome if your household is sterilized like crazy, right? So,
Yeah.
toilet, sterilize it, shower. Of course, you don't want mold and mildew to grow, sterilize it. But most surfaces in your home don't need to be wiped down with bleach and all of that stuff, right? Including the floors and all that. We, for example, in my house, we don't allow outside shoes in the house, right? Everyone comes in and they leave their outside shoes right in the mudroom or wherever. And then you walk into the house in your house slippers or whatever. So that's what bringing in all the dirty bugs from the public restroom we were just in the house. You don't necessarily have to sterilize your floor either.
Exactly.
It's just a matter of basic cleaning. Kitchen counters and all that, for the most part, we don't sterilize, with the exception of if we bring raw meat, for example, you're working with raw chicken, you want to clean up the chicken juice
Of course.
and sterilize that, right? So just using some basic sense like that. Um, Personal care products, it becomes so important to try to go as natural, as clean on your personal care products as you can, avoiding ones that have lots of preservatives in it and so on that can impact your microbiome. So I've gone through exercises of trying to find the most clean toothpaste, trying to find the most clean deodorant. You don't have to revamp your entire medicine cabinet, pantry. Just pick a few targets, trying to get the
Right.
most clean lotion. So for me, over time, I found the cleanest deodorant that works for me, the cleanest lotion that works for me, the cleanest toothpaste that works for me. Those little things make a big difference.
Yeah.
Getting outside into nature, right? And I'm not talking about your backyard. I'm talking about, your backyard is still better than nothing. But if you can go for a hike, or if you live in the coast, go to the beach, untouched natural environments, but being prescriptive about it, you
Mhm.
know, prescribing yourself 30 minutes 2 times a week or 30 minutes 3 times a week, like going out in nature, just walking around, just being outside will add to the diversity of the microbiome, not only in your gut, but it'll modulate the diversity of microbiome in your skin and all that. And that can be huge help to people, right? That in itself can make them change their perspectives on world and all that. Just getting out into nature and feeling in touch with nature a little bit. Do some meditative practices if you can, things to calm you down, spoil yourself a little bit. Know that you're worth that spoiling, right? We're all working hard. We're all trying to do the best we can. And
Yeah.
we really need a little bit of pampering and a little bit of spoiling every once in a while, because that releases oxytocin. So that's one of the reasons why I love massage a lot, because studies show that massage increases your oxytocin. And when your oxytocin goes up, your stress hormone levels go down, right? So that reduces inflammation over time. And then a couple of things, you can easily take a probiotic, like we work with Vegas probiotic. There's a probiotic I talked about that we did all the leaky gut research on. And then the Zen Biome, which is the probiotic that we worked on for the gut brain axis with the species with the peptidoglycan in it. Taking those probiotics makes it easy, helps you with it, but you want to do the other things as well, really support your system overall. And here's one critically important thing. It can't be just one person in the house that's all into this and trying to do this, right? Because we all share a microbiome cloud within our household, hence the flushing the toilet. So one of the things when last time Robyn and I were when I met her and I was doing a lecture to functional medicine doctors about this, I was describing to them how the study showed that individuals that were taking antibiotics, of course, during the course of antibiotics, and then upwards of 6 months after, their microbiome got completely perturbed, right? Which is no surprise. We know antibiotics do that. What was surprising is the researchers also found that people that lived in their same household who were not taking the antibiotics also saw the same disruption in their microbiome. And that's because we share this cloud of microbes. And one of the examples of how we share clouds of microbes is through the toilet, for example. You sit down in the toilet, put in the water, and you flush it, and it's spitting everything around. A lot of the surface bacteria that's been pulled from the poop into the water gets aerosolized, right? And then once it's aerosolized, it's up in the air, it gets sucked into your HVAC system and blown back out to everybody else, to everything else, your food, your utensils, all with the things, right? So this poop back to your house. And so that's where it's like, okay, maybe we'll close the toilet and then flush it, reduce the poop bacteria. But what's important about that message is that, if you have one person in the household that's all motivated to improve their health, their outcomes, their wellness, like mom, for example, let's take a mom that's stressed, that is concerned about related disorders, concerned about appearance of skin and all that, but you have like, a husband or another significant other that doesn't care about it so much, or you have kids that are unhealthy and running around and being crazy, and you're trying to do your best to improve your own health, their biomes are screwing up your progress, right? So it becomes really important to be under the champion of the household's health. So the things that you figure out and you realize to do that's healthy for you, you impart that as much as you can, to whatever degree you can to the other people in your household as well, because their microbiomes are influencing yours, right? So that's another important message to put across as well. I think those of us that have the knowledge, have to be stewards of this knowledge and have to be the beacon of health and wellness in our own little micro communities, because our little micro communities influence us.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, because we're 90% bug.
exactly, we are, and some of us, spent their time listening to this whole interview, right? Which I'm grateful for. If you listen to all my crazy talking and you get some messages out of it, one of the most valuable things you can do with it is pass it on to other people,
Yeah.
right? Help educate them so that
Absolutely.
everybody around you is empowered to improve their health.
Yeah.
And when everybody's empowered, the effects on each individual is actually much more profound.
Yeah.
Right? It's a group effort. It takes a village to preserve and improve our microbiomes, because it took a village to develop the microbiome. Right? We all share bugs. We share these organisms. We
Mm-hmm.
always have, right? So that's an important way to think about it, I think.
Absolutely. I love that. And, that's been a big thing with, me and my household of getting my husband on, the same probiotics and things that I'm on, and getting his diets down to where it needs to be, because, it's affecting me and mine affects him. So, it is a team effort. It's a community effort, and we need to take care of each other like that. Um, One really quick question that came into Instagram that I want to ask you really fast is, how long, if we take a probiotic, how long will that stay in us, or before things die? Do we need to keep taking it? How long do we take it? Do we need to switch up? Some people are saying, oh, switch probiotics every 6 months.
Yeah. So the whole idea of like cycling through probiotics and all that has no scientific basis or rationale to it, right? Um, it's not natural. So the way I look at probiotics is, to me, as a microbiologist and somebody that respects and looks at evolutionary biology and all of that, taking a probiotic should somehow mimic our natural exposure to bacteria, right? Like how we are supposed to actually interact with microbes, because that's the biggest problem we have today. Through the course of human evolution, we had this beautiful mutualistic relationship with microbes around us, right? Where we live within the land, we gain huge exposure to microbes of food and drink and behaviors and all that, digging for roots and tubers in the ground and drinking waters out of rivers and streams and sleeping in the dirt, right? All of that gave us very close interaction to microbes, and we consumed a lot of the microbes on a regular basis. One of the biggest drivers of our health conditions is the fact that we've divorced ourselves from nature, right? We're all in relatively sterile environments. How often are we actually going and getting adequate exposure to microbes? So to me, taking a probiotic should somehow mimic that type of relationship, right? So nowhere in nature do our ancestors go, I've got enough exposure to this microbe, I'm going to cycle over there a little bit. That's not how it works, right? Or, I tube where I got to get the microbes in between meals and maybe refrigerate this microbe for a little while. So all of those add on directives, like this has to be refrigerated, this has to be in between meals, this has to be, cycle through every 3 months or 6 months. All those are just nonsensical things that have no scientific basis at all. I can assure you, having read tens of thousands of publications of probiotics and published my studies myself, that there's no science behind any of that. Right? A good functioning probiotic should be one typically is transitional within your system, right? They're not microbes that'll go in and colonize and stay forever, right? They're microbes that go in, perform a function, whether it's sealing up the tight junctions with the bad bacteria, sealing up the leakiness in the gut, reducing the inflammation and all that. But after a period of time, a week or two, they tend to leave the system.
Okay.
Because if microbes that we took always stayed in our systems, at some point we'd have a crazy, overwhelming number of microbes in there that just doesn't make sense. So nature has designed it where probiotic bacteria that are designed to come in through the digestive tract tend to leave at some point. So they're transient in nature, right? So the best probiotics out there are going to be ones that are transient in nature, have good clinical trials supporting what they in the system. And then most importantly, they fix some fundamental problems in the system, like leak. If they can fix that, then it's doing you a huge favor in your overall health and wellness. So you should not have to cycle through probiotics. You should not have to be so strict about taking it between meals. You should not have to refrigerate your probiotic. All that is nonsensical stuff that came up before we knew anything about the microbiome while probiotics are being developed. So
Right.
hopefully that answered that question.
It did. It did. Thank you very much. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you, how would you recommend they do that?
So I try to interact with people as much as I can on social media and all that. I'm always super passionate about providing people information. So you can reach out to me on Instagram. I think my handle is Kiran Biome, so KIRANBIOME, or on Facebook. I think if you just look up Kiran Krishnan, you'll find me on there. So feel free to reach out that way, or certainly come to our website, Microbiome Labs, with an S.com, and lots of resources on there as well.
Yeah. And on your Instagram, y'all, you definitely need to follow him there. He does little tidbits, microbiome moments, I think it's called, where he does like a 5 minutes little teaching, and I learn a lot from it. So, I mean, you can never stop learning. So,
And I post a lot of my lectures and interviews and all that where you can access them on there.
yeah,
Because I do about 65 lectures and maybe another 100 or so interviews. So
again, where do you find the time?
it's the resiliency.
Okay, well, you guys, thank you, Kiran. Thank you so, so, so very much for being on. And I'm going to try to get back, you guys, at some point in time, maybe do a little bit of a Q&A. But thank you so much for spending all of this time with us. And you guys, if you stuck it out, thank you. And really, I encourage you to go back and re-listen to this, because I'm going to. You're going to need to listen to it a couple of times to really let that information absorb in. And if you want to catch up with me a little bit more, you can catch me on social media as well at Robynn Lynn, all over the place. And it's RBYNNLIN. That's also my website. And hopefully you'll join me here next time on Becoming Ageless, where we discover new tips, tricks, actions, and science to increase your whole health span. So thank you guys once again.